busy week at the Vatican continued today. The Holy Father celebrated Mass for the Feast of the Epiphany, which is being celebrated in many parts of the world. He also delivered a special address to pilgrims. But many of the faithful are still reflecting on the funeral yesterday and saying goodbye to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. Joining us now from Rome is Father Raymond De Souza, priest from the Archdiocese of Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and contributor to the National Catholic Register. Father, thank you so much for your time today. Talking about the funeral, can you tell us something more about that, and what were your personal highlights of the historic day?
Well, the historic day that was emphasized throughout our coverage this week was the fact that you have a retired pope. That's something very rare and never before buried with the sort of full honors by his successors. That was clearly the unusual element. But more than that, in terms of history, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, had a very long life. When he was born in 1927, that was closer to the Civil War than it is today, to give you some sense of how long his life was. And so we've come to the end of a very long period of time. We marked the 60th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council a few months ago. He's the last significant figure from that council. He and John Paul, with their historic partnership, which began in 1978 to 1981 in that period, that's now 45 years in the past. And his own pontificate is 10 years in the past after his abdication in 2013. So we've come to the end of a very long period on multiple levels. That doesn't mean that his contributions belong to the past, quite to the contrary, but there is a sense that something was brought to completion here this week. A 35-year pontificate, if you want to say, in two parts, John Paul and Benedict, and this 60-year period in the life of the Church that began with the Council. All those things have come to an end in a certain sense with the death of this great personality. And now the seeds that were planted, many of them, are some bearing fruit and many left to bear fruit as well. So that would be my sense of the week here in Rome.
Yeah, and can you also talk about the mood there at the Vatican during this past week?
Well, I would say it would be very much like someone who dies in the family, who's very elderly, 95 years old, who's very faithful, ready for death. It's not a tragedy. It's actually the natural unfolding of things and a supernatural unfolding of things. Pope Benedict was ready to die. He'd written in his last sort of public statement in February, almost a year ago now, that he was soon to pass through the door of death. And he gave us a model of a good and holy death, what we call a happy death, fortified by the sacrament. So there's a lot of esteem and affection in Rome and around the world for Pope Benedict. But this was more an occasion, I would say, of gratitude than grief this past week, although there's always a touch of sadness. But there's more gratitude here than grief, because what we saw unfold was what we hope for those who are dear to us and for ourselves one day.
And Father, we have probably about 30 seconds left or so, but wondering, what do you think will be Pope Benedict's legacy?
The longest project of his life was the reasonableness of the faith, that it's reasonable to believe, in fact, reason demands answers to questions that it can't provide for itself, that it needs faith. His spiritual testament returned to that very question, the reasonableness of the faith. He dedicated his very long, very fruitful, brilliant theological and pastoral career to that question, faith and reason, but not just that they're both valid, but that reason, the human being, the one who asks questions about the most important and enduring things, needs faith to answer them, that it's a failure to exclude God and the data of revelation from that quest. So I think that's going to be his enduring legacy, is the reasonableness of the faith. But his legacy is so broad it includes many other things as well, especially the liturgy and the person of Jesus Christ, whom he helped us to get to know better in, for example, his 3 volumes called Jesus of Nazareth.
Father De Souza, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. God bless you.